Hi everyone, and welcome to the Australian and New Zealand Chardonnay tasting. My name's Natasha Hughes. I'm a Master of Wine and a long-time lover of Australian wines, in fact, everything Australia. And I'm here to present 3 Australian Chardonnays.
Hello everybody, my name's Ronan Sayburn. I'm head of wine for 67 Pall Mall, CEO for the Court of Master Sommeliers in Europe, and a big fan of New Zealand and New Zealand wines and everything New Zealand really. So I have 3 great New Zealand Chardonnays to present as well, and we're going to be talking about the countries, about Chardonnay there, about just Chardonnay in general. So very nice to see you, Natasha.
Good to see you too. And let's get going with that first slide. Do you want to talk us through that, Ronan?
Well, absolutely. I mean, just sort of a little bit climatically, I think that most people in the world now realise that Chardonnay is probably better from a slightly cooler environment than a too hot an environment. And both of these countries where they're growing the grapes are really kind of delivering both of that. So as you can see, New Zealand, very much an island, very much a maritime influenced island. And over here in Australia, really where you're planting grapes, it's got to be really southern coast more than anywhere else. So coastal areas. What you're getting from Antarctic, but basically what you get on the planet is something called the Coriolis effect. And the Coriolis effect is as the planet is like a huge sphere, as it spins and it rotates at 24,000 miles an hour, which gives us a 24-hour cycle. The widest part is the equator. So along the equator, you have the most drag. So anything that's essentially not nailed down is going to get pulled backwards. And what that happens really is things like water and things like wind. So as the earth is moving in this direction from west to east, water and air is getting dragged backwards in this direction, and that has to go somewhere. So in the southern hemisphere, it kind of curls around in an anti-clockwise kind of cyclone. So what you're happening is the equator coming up here, you're getting wind and water which is being pulled around in this direction like this. And what's happening from the Antarctic is you're getting cold air and cold water moving in this direction. So it's kind of like moving like this up here and like this down here. So you're getting cold water getting pulled up here along to Margaret River, along into the bay around here, around sort of McLaren Vale, down here sort of Coonawarra area, and then especially in Port Phillip Bay, so all around Melbourne area, and Tasmania is really in the brunt of all of that cold Antarctic air. Similarly in New Zealand, you're getting cold air running up this side of the country down here, and then slightly differently in the North Island, because you're on the sort of the tail of this this wind and water current that's moving in this direction anti-clockwise, you're getting slightly warmer air which is coming in to the North Island, making it slightly warmer. It's slightly further north anyway, but it's giving it a slightly warmer, more tropical kind of environment. And you do see that in the styles of Chardonnay. And this really has a lot to do with this wind coming in this direction, coming from west to east, and it's hitting that spine of mountains on New Zealand there that acts as a rain shadow, keeps most of the island relatively kind of blue skies, not much rainfall, and a lot of rainfall hitting these mountains and falling as snow or rain. So the New Zealanders would say, a lot of the bad things come from the west. I'm sure they're just talking about the bad weather and not the Australians. But yeah, that's what happens. The bad weather comes down here, hits this, and it keeps that country blue skies, nice and bright, even though you're quite cool maritime climate, but lots of UV rays ripening up those grapes. So that's a very brief kind of description of the Coriolis effect.
Right. I think we're going to move on to some specifics, but for those of you who haven't got the wines with you, you probably didn't get the tasting booklet, but it's available as a link for you to download, and hopefully you'll be able to see that. And apologies, I realize that you guys can't see the cursor or anybody sort of trying to point things out on a map. So bear with us, and we'll try and make things as clear as possible through description. So just generally speaking, this is a map of Australia with the wine regions pointed out. As you can see from the list at the left, there's 65 wine regions, and of those, 59 grow Chardonnay. It's It's one of the most widely planted grapes in Australia, with, I think, currently 21,442 hectares out of 155,442 hectares planted to Chardonnay alone. And we're going to talk today mainly about the areas sort of around Melbourne and Hobart. And we'll see those in more close-up detail when we actually get onto the wines.
But yeah, and then looking at New Zealand, I mean, a much smaller country. New Zealand in total is just under 40,000 hectares. To put that into context, Austria is about 45,000. So the entire production in New Zealand is very similar to that of Austria. And really, from that whole area, from that 40,000 hectares, 27,000 hectares is based in Marlborough. So nearly 75% of all the wine produced in New Zealand is coming from Marlborough. So it means that there's only around about 10,000 hectares in the rest of the country. Probably the biggest, and Chardonnay would be planted very successfully up in Hawke's Bay. It's about 1,000 hectares in Hawke's Bay. It's about 1,000 hectares down in Marlborough. It's about 900 odd hectares in Nelson, 600 hectares in Nelson, sorry, and just about 90 in North Canterbury. So the total plantings of Chardonnay for New Zealand is only 3,300 hectares, which is not dissimilar from the Côte de Beaune. So not very big at all. Tiny, tiny amounts. If you looked at things like Syrah and Pinot Noir, it's tiny amounts. But I think that they do pack a big punch. I think everyone knows about the quality of New Zealand's Chardonnay. They probably don't realise how little of it is actually made.
Okay, so we're going to talk about terroir in the broadest terms here, in terms of both Australia and New Zealand. But one thing that I wanted to point out is that when you talk about Chardonnay in Burgundy, which is the reference point for a lot of people for high quality Chardonnay, terroir in Burgundy is largely about soil. It's where the limestone is and what the depth of limestone is, and that plays a large part in determining quality and typicity. And in Australia in particular, the geology is so fragmented that the linking thread to these high quality production regions for Chardonnay is more about climate and this cool climate generated by these cooling currents of the Southern Ocean rather than geology. And how much the ocean influences the climate can be better understood if you were to flip the map of Australia over into the Northern Hemisphere. And of the three regions that I'm going to talk about today, the Mornington Peninsula and Geelong can roughly be mapped to the Alentejo in Portugal or Napa Valley in the USA. And Tasmania would be further north, somewhere around Chianti or Bondol. Now, look, clearly the climates in these regions are very different to the Mornington Peninsula, different to the Alentejo, to Napa Valley, to Chianti, to Bondol. They're nowhere near as hot. And that's all down to being bathed in these cooling breezes from the Southern Ocean. But there's something else going on in terms of determining the styles of wines made in Australia, the style of Chardonnay being made. It used to be that Chardonnay was the flag bearer for sunshine in a glass. Australian Chardonnay was bumptious and big and ripe and fruity and pretty in your face. And there's been a pendulum swing in recent years away from that style. Some would argue that the pendulum swung a little bit too far, maybe sort of about 10 years ago. But now it's settling somewhere sort of much more central. And there's been a move away from that sunshine in a glass, but the wines are no longer sort of skinny, stick-thin wines with really high acidity and no mid-palate. What a lot of producers in these cool climate zones are aiming for is something refined and elegant with good levels of acidity, not too marked by oak or other winemaking factors. They want the wines to speak for themselves. And I think there's been a move away from this kind of cultural cringe. Earlier on, I talked about the way that Burgundy was the yardstick for a lot of people in terms of Chardonnay. But for a lot of producers now, they don't want to measure themselves against Burgundy. They're really proud to be discovering the Australian terroir and learning to make the most of it. So the first wine that we're going to taste today is the Kooyong Clonal, and it comes from the Mornington Peninsula. And as you can see from that map, the Mornington Peninsula is literally that. It's a peninsula that juts out into Port Phillip Bay, and it's bathed on both sides by cooling breezes. But there's actually a spine of hills that runs down the middle of it. And depending on where you are in the Mornington Peninsula, there are lots of different altitudes and exposures, as well as these cooling ocean currents. And all of that means that the wines made in the Mornington Peninsula tend to have a lot of freshness and bright fruit characters, as well as this nice crisp acidity. And the wine that we're going to look at first is the Clonal Chardonnay from Kooyong. And I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to pour that wine and taste it, and then we'll discuss it in terms of its context, where it's made, and how it's made.
Yeah, and if I could just say, I think that everyone's kind of followed that model of Burgundy, but the model of Burgundy's changed. 20, 30 years ago, what the hell am I making wine Burgundy? With global warming, things are just different. But Burgundy used to be make Chardonnay up there, and it was fairly sort of acidic and tart, and not very exciting, to be honest. Chardonnay, to be honest, isn't a very, very aromatic grape. But if you're making that in a very cool marginal climate in Burgundy, you needed to give it some depth and some weight. So barrel aging, leaving it on its lees, doing lots of batonnage, putting it 100% through its malolactic to reduce that kind of that rapier-like acidity that you were getting in Burgundy. That was all sort of standard practice. And a lot of New World producers followed the Burgundian model, new oak, on the lees, 100% malolactic. But when you're not in a marginal climate where it's very, very cool and you're getting high acid, what you end up with is very rich, very deep, very golden, oaky, buttery styles of wine, which suddenly everyone said, wow, this is great. But then the world very quickly moved away from that. And I always think Chardonnay, a bit like the chicken of the wine world, you can kind of do lots of different things with it. It's a very adaptable grape, and it's very much the winemaker's grape. So they can do these different winemaking things with Chardonnay, like barrel aging or old barrel aging to give it oxidative characters, but not new oak. They can do lees stirring. They can do certain amounts of malolactic to it. They can block the malolactic, or they can let it run its course. So it can be a bit more of a kind of a ball of clay in a way. And winemakers, as long as they've got the right clonal material, the right soils, hopefully a coolish climate, they can kind of sculpt the Chardonnays a little bit to a modern taste.
And I think that's what we're going to see as we taste through our way through these wines. Terroir obviously has some impact, but winemaking decisions have a huge influence on the way the wines turn out in the end. And this particular wine, so it comes from, I mentioned that the Mornington Peninsula has this kind of volcanic outcrop, but the further north on the peninsula you get, the further towards Melbourne, the lower the altitude and the flatter it is. And this particular wine is grown on this area, which is known locally as down the hill. Up the hill is further out into Port Phillip Bay, and it's the warmest part of the peninsula, but it's still influenced by the ocean breezes. It's only 10 kilometers from the ocean on both sides to this vineyard, and it's at about 100 meters altitude. So in terms of overall climate, compared to inland regions, it isn't as warm, and you don't get the cold spikes either. It's a really even, gentle climate that allows the Chardonnay to ripen very smoothly. But the ocean influence lets them hold the acidity and keep the flavors on that kind of bright, kind of citrusy and light stone fruit characters. In terms of clones, this is made from a really Australian mix of clones. You've got a mix of Dijon clones, which give kind of weight and richness to the wines, and the Mendoza clone, which is also called the Gingin clone in Australia, which has basically poor fruit set. So you get very small berries as well as very large berries, and that allows the wine to retain acidity. In terms of winemaking, it's quite hands-off in style. Wild yeast, 9 months in French oak barriques, but not very much of that oak is new. So the idea is to have a fairly neutral oak influence. And there's no lees stirring, which gives you that kind of lovely linear palate that enhances the freshness of that wine. It's very much about sort of letting the terroir and the wine speak for itself, rather than layering on too much makeup and sort of altering its intrinsic character.
Yeah, it's pretty much in that tropical kind of pineapple nectarine kind of style. I've written melon, peach, that sort of things, and there's that nice biscuity, nutty kind of character, but not too heavy. And the acidity, the tartaric acid, is only 5.4. And when you taste it, you do feel that it's very broad and very full in the mouth, but it doesn't have a very, very sharp acidity to it. I mean, I think it's great. It's great wine.
Yeah. There's a linearity and a freshness to it, as well as that fruit. I mean, it's very much a fruit-driven wine, but it's still got enough zip and zest to really belong firmly in that cool climate style of Chardonnay, rather than something riper and richer and heavier.
Yeah, and then I think maybe I shouldn't say this. Maybe I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I think that in Australia not long ago when I was there, I did find that they were making some very, very lean Chardonnays, probably too extreme. I remember a winemaker in the Yarra Valley saying to me, it's kind of like fishbone Chardonnay, which is you go to a restaurant and order a fish and it comes out and it's just a fish skeleton. There's no actual flesh on it. But I think that's kind of shifted again, and they're moving away from the more reductive styles, and they are packing a bit of weight into it. And I think my conversations with Australia and New Zealand winemakers are Chardonnay's supposed to be fun. Don't make it too serious. We do like a bit of that sunshine. It is a bit indulgent, isn't it? It's the sunshine in the glass. But as long as it's balanced, I don't think we mind some ripeness in Chardonnay.
Yes, absolutely. I think that there's an acknowledgement generally in Australia that the pendulum did swing too far away from that very ripe sunshine in the glass style to something that was probably picked too early, and it was too skinny and too high in acidity and didn't really have the fruit on the mid palate to kind of carry itself well. With a lot of that reductive winemaking as well, that gave you that struck match character that kind of came to dominate the fruit, and they weren't much fun. And I think there's been a resettling of the pendulum that I think it's the Goldilocks winemaking effect. It's swung from being too fat and rich and ripe to being too skinny, and now it's settled somewhere really, really nice in the middle.
Yeah. And I think it was Tim Atkin that first used the phrase a few years ago. I think he said, did he call it the Mornington reduction? And it was people like 10 Minutes by Tractor that were doing that, and it was just kind of a little bit too reductive, maybe. But it was definitely a new style that was coming out from these warmer climate countries.
Right. Much as I love spending time on Australian wines, should we move on to your first Kiwi wine?
So the next one that we have is the Taylor's Pass. From arguably one of the top wineries in New Zealand, Villa Maria. And I know we all see Villa Maria in supermarkets. But their top end wines are absolutely phenomenal. They're single vineyards, and I think the Taylor's Pass Chardonnay is really one of their top wines. And I don't think, or Mr. Wadsack, he can't see my cursor, but the kind of Taylor's Pass is, if you look down where Seddon is, where in the Hour Tree, and then when you look where the town of Seddon is, Taylor's Pass is kind of going up between the Tree Valley and over into sort of towards Blenheim. So you're coming right up into the hills over here. And I know, Natasha, this is all supposed to be very friendly Chardonnay comparison, but when I tasted this wine, I was like, oh my word, that's a good wine. I think it has that tension and that tightness and acidity that you would find, in like a good Puligny Montrachet or something like that. That kind of electricity of acidity. I was like, wow, I thought this wine was just phenomenal.
It's got a really nice textural component, a sort of richness on the mid palate that's kind of lit up by that acidity, which I think it makes for a really pleasing balance.
Yeah, I just love that way that acid just comes in and just grabs you by the throat, but then it has all that rich kind of nectarine, fruit, peach, and all that sort of character around with it as well, and then just that long and very taut minerality on the back of the palate. I think it's a really, really good wine. I think that's one of their top vineyards. I think, for them. So the vines there are between 12 and 17 years old. It's kind of based on a series of terraces that are made of clay and sand with a bit of gravel. And really those different terraces, whether it's clay or whether it's sand or whether it's gravel, everything that's planted there will bring a different, slightly different expression of Chardonnay into the overall blend at the end. So, and our tree is getting that cold wind, that Antarctic wind that's blowing up that valley. Blenheim's a little bit protected by that, by the Wither Hills, but our tree's generally a bit cooler. You would say normally the Sauvignon Blanc over in the Our tree is a bit more tomato stalky because it's slightly cooler, whereas maybe the Wairau and the Southern Valleys can be a bit more tropical, even asparagus-y. But the Our tree is more on the tomatoey. So it is getting that cooling influence from the wind coming up that valley and channeling its way through places like Taylor's Pass. So I think that's just a phenomenal wine. So vines were planted in 2000, and the clone 95 and rootstock 10114. So it's all picked whole bunch. 50% of it is indigenous wild yeast, and it'll go through about 40%. Go through a minimum amount of stirring, and about 40% of it goes through malolactic. And I think you can see that in that tension of acidity that you're getting, that it's not gone through full malolactic. So yeah, there's Taylor's Pass. So that's the Our tree just down there. So no, as a single vineyard wine, I think that's just a great expression of Chardonnay. I don't know. We can see the chat. Anyone else got any opinions on those two wines that we started with?
Not that anybody's kind of keeping score at all. Friendly trans-Tasman rivalry.
Yeah. No, like I said, I know we're not supposed to be scoring points, but I was pretty pleased when I tried that wine.
That is a pretty special wine, actually. I think that's great value for money and a terrific expression of Chardonnay. But yeah, if you've got any questions or comments about either of those wines, now's the time to make them.
Yeah, there's a lot of familiar faces on this chat, I must say. I've been doing quite a lot of Zoom recently, and there's a lot of familiar names on there, which is good to see. So, and Natasha, are you drinking Chardonnay at the moment? Were you a bit of the ABC kind of going against Chardonnay, or what's your opinion on it? Because I think nowadays we did a lot of discussion recently about the Empereur Burgundies and the prices that you're paying for Empereur Burgundy now. As you being a tutor for a lot of MW students, it must be difficult for students, especially, to start tasting that great expressions of single vineyard cruise in Burgundy. So
absolutely. I think that Burgundy has become dare I say it, prohibitively priced. I mean, that some of the wines are fantastic and they make my heart sing when I drink them. I don't even want to taste those wines. They're wines for drinking. But I do think that one of the greatest pleasures of tasting as widely as I do, as most of us do, is the realization of how many great wines are made around the world. And if you're prepared to sort of take off the blinkers and look beyond the classic regions, I think the New World in general, but Australia and New Zealand in particular, are making just some world-beating Chardonnays these days. They're really wines that are such stunning value compared to some of the classic regions.
Yeah, and it's a complex puzzle, isn't it? It's finding the right clones for the right soil, of the right rootstocks, the right clones, getting it all planted in the right areas, and that takes time. And a lot of these new world countries really, it's what, 30 years since really they started playing big roles in wine drinking.
Yes, I mean it was effectively what I was alluded to a little bit earlier. They, in Australia certainly, and presumably in New Zealand as well, they've stopped the cultural cringe. They've stopped comparing themselves to Burgundy. I was talking to a winemaker in the Adelaide Hills the other day who said that 10 years ago the biggest compliment you could pay me was to tell me that my Chardonnay tasted Burgundian. And now all I want to know is this is a great expression of the Adelaide Hills. So I think there's a growing confidence in winemakers in these regions that they've found the right places to grow their grapes. But I also think it's the winemaking part of the puzzle has fallen into place. I think was, not to denigrate them, there's some very fine sort of older generation winemakers in Australia, but I think a lot of them got trained in colleges where they were trained to make bulk wines to a recipe, and to try and sort of achieve something with their wines that maybe their terroir wasn't giving them in the first place. And there's a growing confidence now that they can make Australian or New Zealand expressions, great expressions, local expressions of Chardonnay, and they've played around with the winemaking enough to have worked out what works for the clones that they grow in the places that they've discovered.
Yeah.
And it's all sort of coming together. I think these wines are starting to look really, really smart.
And vine age part to play in that as well. So you've got to have it in the ground for a while before it really starts adapting to its environment. And I was in Australia a few years ago for 2 weeks. There was a big group of us travelled around under the James Busby travel scholarship, and we finished up in Margaret River. And one of the last wines that we had for the whole trip, the usual kind of 800, 900 wines we tasted, and the wine for the entire trip, without a doubt, was the 2015 Kevin John Chardonnay from Cullen, and it was as good as any white Grand Cru Burgundy I've ever tried. It was stunning. It was an absolute amazing wine. Yeah. So, and I think when you're in a place like Cullen where they've just got everything right, the biodynamics, the soils, the rootstocks, the clones, and when you see that Chardonnay comes in, it goes across a triage table, and then it gets dropped into a basket press, gets slightly crushed, and then it's in barrel. There's nothing hugely complex about it. But what a wine.
Absolutely, and I think it's interesting. We're looking today in terms of Australia. We're looking at Victoria and Tasmania, but I think there are great places in Western Australia and in South Australia to make fantastic world-class Chardonnay that people are really sort of cottoning on to. Yeah. I think there's some really clever stuff starting to come out.
Absolutely. Well, should we move on to the next wine?
I think we should, because I think, if we're talking about exciting places to make wine and fairly undiscovered places, Tasmania is, it's the next big thing in Australian wine, but it's been the next big thing for ever such a long time. So, Tasmania is this island off the southern coast of Australia, and it is pretty cool climate. It gets very snowy there in winter, and in summer it doesn't tend to get that hot. It's just bathed in these cooling ocean currents, and it's been making they've been making, I think it's probably best known over here maybe for sparkling wines, but I think there's some really smart Chardonnay and Pinot Noir being made there, and increasingly some lovely sort of cool climate Syrah, and some Rieslings are starting to come out, but most of it doesn't make it out of Australia. So I'm really pleased to be able to show the Ghost Rock Bonnedale Vineyard Chardonnay. Now this particular wine comes from the Cradle Coast, which isn't even marked on this map. It is, well, basically, if I say that Tasmania makes less than 1% of all Australian wine, and the Cradle Coast makes about 3 or 4% of Tasmania's wine, that will give you some idea of how small it is. Effectively, the whole growing region is 37 hectares of vineyards, of which 30 are farmed by Ghost Rock. And it's right on the north coast. The vineyard itself is about 4 or 5 kilometers from the ocean, and it is the coolest region in Tasmania, which in itself is the coolest place to grow grapes in Australia. And the vineyards were planted 20 years ago by Justin, who's the winemaker, by Justin's parents. So Justin did that kind of apprentissage where he went to make wine at Devil's Lair in Western Australia and Coldstream in Victoria, in the Coldstream Hills in the Yarra Valley. And he's come back to his Tassie homeland, where he makes Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And generally speaking, what you tend to find in these really cool climates is that you get this very bright fruit character, this pristine, bright, almost kind of crystalline fruit character, and this sort of racy acidity. So that's what I was expecting to see in this wine. In general terms, the vineyards are planted in a rain shadow. There's mountain ranges to the west and east, and basically they break up the rain. So the vineyard itself gets just about enough rain every year to keep it going. And it falls outside the critical months of March and April, which are the run up to harvest. So basically, the way Justin tells it, you know, the rainfall, generally speaking, is at that ideal time of year in winter when you want to get those sort of hydric reserves plumped up in the vineyard, ready for another season of growth. And there's constant airflow from the sea breezes. So the rain, any rain that falls on the plants as they're growing during the vegetative growth season just gets dried away. And as well as being the coolest region in Tasmania, they have the mildest winters in Tasmania. So they only get 2 or 3 frosts, and temperatures in summer are mild, and they rarely peak above 30 Celsius. So it's a little bit of a great paradise, really. And the wine we're going to taste comes from the Bonnedale Vineyard, which rises to a peak of about 80 meters above sea level, so not much of a peak. But basically, the Chardonnay is planted on the highest bit of the vineyard, whereas the red grapes, mainly Pinot Noir, is planted on the flat zones below. And the soil is kind of loam over clay, which gives it really good water retention. So there's plenty of irrigation for the vines throughout the growing season. And in terms of clones, the clone here is 10V1, which is mostly planted in the Yarra Valley, and it's become a bit of a bedrock in Tasmania because a lot of the growers who established the Tasmanian vineyards looked across the straits to Victoria for their planting sources. And it's a late ripening clone, and just to back it up, they've got some 76, which is a Dijon clone, planted alongside it, and the Dijon clone ripens earlier, so it gives it gives the wine a little bit of weight and richness. And like a lot of regions, lot of wineries in Tasmania, these vines are planted on their own roots. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to taste it, and then I'll talk you through the winemaking. And it'd be interesting to
know. Well, I mean, I know there's a lot of excitement in Australia about Tasmania. And you know, maybe it's irksome for many Australians to think that Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand is such a great seller in Australia, but yeah, Tasmania now, if you want cool climate vineyards, yeah, Tasmania is the place to go. So yeah, it's a very exciting region at the moment.
I noticed some debate. Some of you seem to have got some not terribly good samples of this wine. I don't know about you, Ronan, but the one I've got seems to be showing pretty well. And it's got some really lovely sort of bright fruit character and some of that sort of really tangy acidity that
yeah, I mean, mine seems fine. Yeah, if it's not showing, I think who's that? Stuart's saying that it's not showing at its best. It's showing pretty well for me.
That always happens.
Got to turn your phone off on these Zooms. It's like
I can't turn the landline off. Anyway, yeah, a lot of people seem to have not a great example of the Ghost Rock, but I think there seems to be some variation. My version has some lovely fruit purity and some great acidity to it.
Yeah, no, it's a nice wine. How are we doing time-wise? Should we move on to the next wine, so wine number 4?
I just wanted to talk a little bit about winemaking here. Basically, the 10V1 clone is usually fermented with indigenous yeast because it's quite neutral. So they want that wild ferment to add some sort of esters and sulfides to the wine to give it some character, whereas the 76 is fermented with a cultured yeast to keep its rather exuberant aromatics in check. And there's very little oak, or at least very, very little new oak character that's sort of discernible on this wine, largely due to that brightness of the fruit, I think. And yes, how about we move on to the next wine, which is from Nelson.
Yeah, so we're up there in the Moutere Hills there, just above Richmond, for the Neudorf. So Neudorf Rosie's Block Chardonnay, which was given 97 points by Bob Campbell recently, and it was voted New Zealand's #1 Chardonnay. So that was good for them. Obviously, Rosie is the son of Tim and Judy Finn, and the Rosie's Block. If you've been to Neudorf, you will see that they have the home block, which is this kind of area just in front of us. And then I think the hills opposite, about a kilometre away, is the Rosie's Block. So it's for them, it's 20-year-old vineyard, but it's still relatively new for them. And I think, yeah, Neudorf really, for me, came on the scene in the early 2000s with just some like extraordinary, and back then we were all comparing any Chardonnay and Pinot Noir to Burgundy, and just some extraordinary good Burgundian expressions of the wines. Yeah, so and being to this vineyard is something I've never seen before, which I thought was a very clever idea. They're obviously up in Gisborne. Gisborne's right next to the sea. They have a big kind of all the Nelson Sounds and things like that. They have a big restaurant scene there. Everyone's serving oysters that come out of Nelson Sounds, and Tim will go down and collect a truck full of oysters and bring them back, crush the shells up and sprinkle them on the Chardonnay vineyards, which is quite an interesting thing because you're essentially putting calcium back into the soils. I think we'd all agree that Chardonnay likes limestone, it likes calcium. And then they let the chickens out into the vineyards. So the chickens go around, the chickens eat the oyster shells. The chickens do what chickens do in vineyards, which is help fertilize, help eat a few bugs off the trunks. And eating the oyster shells gives them nice hard shells. So I think it's quite an interesting way. Basically they're up in a lot of clay and gravels up there. The clay will give it richness. But it was very interesting to see this idea of crushing oyster shells and putting those on there. Clone wise, it's all Mendoza, so gin, Vente, whatever you want to call it. So that hen and chicken, small berries, big berries, 100% hand harvested, 100% whole bunch. It goes, it's all indigenous yeast from the vineyards. It goes 100% barrel fermentation, so very similar to Cullen. It just gets picked, whole bunches, gets pressed, basket presses, goes straight into barrel. Of all the barrels, it's about 8% new French oak. And it stays in there for 12 months on its lees with monthly batonnage before it goes through 100% malolactic, and then it's just filtered and bottled. So, simple, really. Yeah.
I think it's got some really lovely texture, and it's got a little bit of that flintiness to it, which just, it's so elegant and restrained without being at all sort of skinny. It's such a wine.
I think that these wines, it's a shame to drink them so young.
Yes,
because it's drinking lovely now, but it's very tight. And I think in 10 years this is just going to be incredible.
No, I think it's a very smart wine.
Yeah.
And it just goes back to what we were discussing earlier with the first pair of wines, how although many people are enthralled to the classic regions, there's so much great value to be had from some of the smarter New World regions these days, where really people have actually sort of found their feet in terms of how they're making wines. And where they're planting their vineyards, there's such a growing confidence that I think it's you underestimate these wines at your peril. Yeah,
and for me, I think that Rose Murray Brown just made a comment. Great family, great setting. They're one of the great success stories about a pioneering couple started with nothing, slowly built the business, built the brand, and now one of the most respected wines in New Zealand, if not the world. And I think that that's just the sort of wines that I'd like to buy, and I like to serve, and I like to have on my wine lists, because you're just contributing something really nice to the wine world with having these kind of people making these kind of wines, I think.
So you mentioned that it's a shame to drink this wine this young. How long would you cellar this, given your experience with this particular?
I would like to cellar it for as long as possible, but in the real world, it's not possible. But I think that if you could get hold of these wines at 10 years old, I think that they would be stunning. I've had some 9s before with Tim Finn, 2009s, and they are incredible.
And that's another myth that really needs to be busted. That New World wines don't age well. I think there's such good aging potential from a well-made, cool climate Chardonnay from Australia or New Zealand, that these aren't wines to buy and sort of drink within a year or two of vintage. They really do repay cellaring in the same way that great Chardonnay from anywhere in the world repays cellaring, especially if you don't have Premots to worry about.
At one point in the world, you would have to buy wines and have to cellar them, especially, the great wines of Bordeaux. But now less and less, wines are made to drink to your taste. So whether you like them young and vibrant and full of fruit and, intense, or whether you want to have them slightly more tertiary and aged, I guess is really up to, it's up to the consumer, I think. And I know most of us aren't lucky enough to have cellars and things at home, but I remember speaking to a very well-known producer of Chardonnay in Burgundy who came to one of my restaurants and complained at me because he says, why have you got this on the wine list? It's far too young. I said, why did you sell it to me then? It's not my responsibility to age your wine, and then you criticize. So these people, I think that it's tough for us to sit on large stocks of wine. It's very difficult for the winemakers to do it. Limited space. Very difficult for wine merchants to do it as well, and very difficult to restaurants to do it. So I think if we want to drink these older wines with maturity, we've got to do it ourselves.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. But then most people in the UK, at least, don't have good cellaring facilities at home.
Joe Watson obviously has. He's drinking 2002 Neudorf.
Right. Shall we move on to the last pair of wines?
Yeah.
So we're on the other side of what's often referred to as the Melbourne dress circle with our third wine. And we're going to Geelong. And Geelong is really off most people's radars in terms of even Australian wine in general. And that's because it doesn't export very much, and it doesn't actually produce very much. It's despite it being sort of slightly larger in size, in area than the Mornington Peninsula. I think there's less wine being made there, so we don't get to see very much of it. But I think this particular wine that we're going to taste, which is from Bannockburn, and it's their Geelong Chardonnay, I think is a really cracking example of the Australian Chardonnay pendulum swing stopping in a real sweet spot. So Geelong is latitudinally similar to the Morning Peninsula. It's you know, there's a very small difference in terms of latitude. But whereas the Mornington is surrounded on both sides by water, giving it a more maritime climate, Geelong is further away from the sea. Having said that, the systems that come up from the coast prevent any of the warm air from central Australia from dominating the region. So there's freshness, but generally speaking, the daytime is slightly warmer than it is in the Mornington Peninsula, and the nighttime is slightly cooler. So it's ever so slightly more continental in climate. The rainfall average is 420 millimeters, but in this particular vineyard anyway, they have these dark clay soils that basically suck in the water and then seal it up once they're full up, and let any additional rainfall run off. And any runoff is captured by the winery's dam, so it's fed back into the system. Humidity is more or less zero during the growing season, and there's a westerly that blows in from the bight, which keeps fungal diseases at bay. And under all that clay that holds the water, there's some limestone. And of course, limestone is the thing that gives great Burgundian Chardonnay its lovely acidic backbone. And it seems to work here as well. Generally speaking, most of the vineyards planted with a Penfolds clone, and according to the winemaker Matt Holmes, he said P58 is a Penfolds clone, and in Victoria in the 1970s, that's just what you planted. The options were really limited. Australia was just putting its toe in the water with Chardonnay, which sounds strange. I mean, it wasn't all that long ago that Chardonnay was a bit of a novelty in Australia, but here we are in a situation where Australian winemakers had very little in terms of clonal material to play with. So that's this P58. The average vine age in this vineyard is now nearing 35, but they add new plantings every so often. And the new plantings are planted on rootstock just in case phylloxera arrives. Production was certified organic this year. I think I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to taste the wine, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how it was made. But if you've got any comments, Ronan, I'd welcome them.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Bannockburn. I mean, who isn't? I think that the wines are great. You know, I get a lovely kind of that toasted hazelnut, nutty characteristic to that. And again, similar to that Taylor's Pass, that really electric, tense acidity,
yeah,
that kind of grabs you by the jugular, and and focuses your intention on it, and then that lovely long creamy nutty finish. No, it's a great wine, great structure. I always think great Chardonnay for me looks a bit like a frog spawn, so big head, thin tail, and this is what these wines are like. You know, the attack is intense and big and full, and then they trail off into a very, very long, super fine kind of tail of acidity and minerality to them.
Yeah, I mean, this has got a lovely sort of almost electric thread of acidity that just carries that finish for ever such a long time. And it's got that lovely textural weight and richness to it without being at all big or flabby. So in terms of winemaking, you know, it's pressed without enzymes, goes straight to barrel with moderately high solids and ferments at a pretty warm temperature of up to 25 Celsius. And the aim is to create a wine that's got that savoury character from that limestone. According to the winemaker, he says, people think our wines are a bit old school, but I can't make a wine that isn't powerful. It's what the limestone gives him. And he can't make the skinny pendulum swing wines here. And, you know, he said this, and I get the impression that he's pretty pleased that his terroir doesn't give him the skinny pendulum swing wines, that he likes that weight and richness. And I think, as I was saying earlier, I think that wine sort of really hits that sweet spot between generosity and skinniness. It's got that lovely, just, you know, as you said, that sort of rich, round, sort of creamy attack and that lovely, long, elegant finish. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, that like I said earlier with Chardonnay, it's a bit indulgent, you know, a bit of vanilla, a bit of cream, a bit of tropical fruit, a load of fruit, and then the long kind of elegance to it. But, you know, it's indulgent, yeah, but delicious. And I guess when the world did move into oaky Chardonnays, and then you know, the arrival of, you know, nasty oak chips, giving you that kind of cornflake characteristic, which was pretty horrible. I guess that's really sort of trying to you know, cheapen the process by, rather than buying expensive French oak, buying inexpensive wood chips. And I think probably that's really something that people got sick of.
Yeah,
it's nice to see that it's coming back. I'm sure accountants all over the world are very, very happy because there's less oak being used in wineries. But, you know, but yeah, just that amount of oak, I think, is delicious.
but it's only 8% of new oak. I mean, it's fermented in barriques, but the new oak is just such a small, carefully judged seasoning to it. It really sort of highlights that kind of creaminess to the wine. I think it's just done beautifully.
Kevin makes a good comment. Kevin says it's like a Solero ice cream when you get near the stick. And maybe chew the stick a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great image.
Good wine. Nice wine.
Right. Okay, let's move. Shall we move on to your...
Yeah, move on to the final
last
one. So I guess that most people would think that, you know, Hawke's Bay is probably one of the more well-known regions for Chardonnay. And we haven't shown any Hawke's Bay, but you get some great Hawke's Bay Chardonnays. You know, people like Craggy Range are doing some great stuff. The Kidnappers Cliffs, those sort of wines, maybe a bit richer, maybe a bit more tropical, more pineapple, more mango kind of characters. But, you know, we kind of looked really at Southern Island wines. And I don't know, has Canterbury stolen the Chardonnay crown? I maybe think it did, with things like Bell Hill and Pyramid Valley that make just phenomenal Chardonnays. You know, Bell Hill is extraordinarily good, and, you know, things like the is it the Lion's Tooth from Pyramid Valley? It's just a fantastic Chardonnay. So, and I think finding those veins of limestone down in the sort of Canterbury area, there's just some great Chardonnays coming out of here. Yeah, so this is Black Estate. This is their home block. They have 1 hectare of Chardonnay that they planted back in 2010, I believe. Yeah, so just 1 hectare of vines making this wine. It kind of goes, it's hand-picked, whole bunch. It's all indigenous yeast. It goes into tight-grain French casks. It goes for 100% malolactic, and it's unfined and unfiltered. So again, you know, the winemaking process to these wines, I think, is just very, very simple. It's got to be vine age, you know, location, climate, that sort of stuff, which is making these wines the way that they taste. For this one, I do kind of get that more saline kind of wet seaweed kind of characteristic to it. It tastes richer, more kind of more like hay and oats rather than that sort of biscuit and hazelnut. But yeah,
I think that seaweed note is actually a really good description of that kind of very savoury, salty character that's very apparent in that wine. It kind of makes me think a little bit of that sort of smokiness and saltiness that you sometimes get in a whiskey.
Yeah. But rich on the palate, broad. It's got a lot of weight to it. That's going to be a great wine with food, I would think. Talking about things like rainfall in these sort of areas. I didn't really mention it, but back with so where are they? They're 6 kilometers north of the Waipara Junction. I don't think it's on the map, but talking about rainfall there. Rainfall in these sort of areas and generally across New Zealand is about 650 millimeters. Over in Nelson, you get a little bit more, so it's more sort of 930, something like that. You're looking at rainfall throughout the world. Places like London. Well, Bordeaux is about 930. Tuscany is about 900, I think. I'd say Napa Valley is about 700, and London, surprisingly, is about 600, 550, something like that. So, I mean, does that matter? Probably not.
I think the difference may be the way the rain falls, whether it falls in sort of several heavy rainfalls or whether it's a constant mizzle.
Absolutely. So it's drizzling constantly in London. It's still nice to wind up the Tuscans when they come over here and complain about the bloody weather, though, isn't it? In London, it rains more in Tuscany than it does in London. And you look at places like Jerez where it rains 500 millimeters in 50 days, and then it doesn't rain at all after that. So it's building the water table up. But you're talking very much sort of a Mediterranean climate down here. And these wines are the mixture of Mendoza with 95, 548, and 1066. But I think it's just generally, out of all the Chardonnays that we've had, I think this is just a very different expression. It does smell a bit oxidized, but in a nice way. I think Michael's saying, he thinks it's a little bit bruised apple, which I think is. Apple concentrate. So maybe some people are not enjoying this one quite as much. No, but I quite like that oxidized apple, that seaweedy character to it.
I don't think it's showing as well as some of the other New Zealand wines. New Zealand has that lovely pristine fruit character, and I think it's a bit obscured perhaps in this wine. Not that there's any sort of rivalry, but I think it's clear that we've had a bad sample each among our 6 wines, which is a bit of a shame, and one of the risks that I guess you run with these small sort of decanting tastings, which is a shame.
Well, Law Patrick, who's coming from the Loire Valley, says she doesn't mind bruised apples.
Well, I hope there's been sort of plenty of theoretical background that's been interesting enough to make this tasting worthwhile, even if you were unlucky enough to receive a couple of the sort of slightly dodgier bottlings, which is a shame. But I think there have been some really lovely wines, and there's been an interesting opportunity to sort of compare some of the terroir and some of the sort of winemaking attributes that are typical in Australia and New Zealand. And I think, friendly rivalry aside, I think the conclusion that I come to is that both countries are making absolutely cracking examples of really top class world stage level Chardonnays these days.
Absolutely, and at affordable prices. I mean, we know we're not going to get great Chardonnay at £10 a bottle, but a lot of these are approaching 20, if not just slightly over. But I think great value for money.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we were talking about how difficult it is to afford Burgundy these days, and I think that for the price of a bottle of Burgundy, you can take your pick from pretty much any of these wines and have something really nice. Yeah. So unless anybody's got any particular questions or comments, I guess we're sort of heading into an hour, so we should probably wrap this up.
Yeah.
And I hope it was interesting and useful.
Yeah, and a big thank you for everyone attending, and thank you for all your comments. It's been very interesting reading your comments on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much, Natasha.
No, thank you.
Managing the PowerPoint. That's a big stress relief when someone else manages the PowerPoint. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, I was waiting for you to chip in there, but that's fine. Happy to do it. Women multitask. It's what we're here for.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you at a real life tasting in the not too distant future. Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Bye.